Our warm thanks to Jakob Holmgren from the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and a lot about misinformation, a lot of focus on Russia in that panel. And always, isn't it always the fact that the best question comes from the teachers in the room? We thank you for your contribution. Right, let's keep the pace going, because our next panel is still keeping the focus very much on Russia. There's a theme going on here tonight. Strategic ambiguity and military deterrence, restoring the initiative versus Russia. A big round of applause for the moderator of this panel and his panel team, Fredrik Löjdquist, the director of the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies. Sir, welcome.
So, thank you very much for staying on here, although we're a little bit behind schedule for this exciting panel on strategic ambiguity and military deterrence, restoring the initiative versus Russia. We have a Russia crisis at hand that could be described as long-term, structural, and systemic. It's certainly its most violent and aggressive manifestation of that crisis is the aggression against Ukraine, but you could also argue that this goes beyond Ukraine, both in time and space. So the question is, how can we deal and manage this Russian challenge? It could be argued, and many argue that, but so far we've been having a reactive mode. It's rather Russia that has the strategic initiative. But how can we, the West, take the strategic initiative, constraining Russia rather than allowing Russia to constrain us? And how can we avoid allowing Russia harvesting fruits of its aggression? We are also discussing here the strategic ambiguity. Have we perhaps been even too ambiguous? Sometimes ambiguity can be constructive and sometimes it can be destructive. What are the kind of strategic signaling that we are sending to Russia? And what are the signals that are received in the Kremlin? And what are the sort of alternatives for taking the strategic initiative and succeeding in the opportunity cost? With us for this, we have an excellent panel. From your left to the right here, Michael Carpenter, who is a special assistant to the President and Senior Director for European Affairs at the National Security Council in the United States of America. Second, Muriel Domenach, who until very recently was the French permanent representative to NATO in Brussels. Third, Daria Kaleniuk, co-founder, among many other things, for the International Center for Ukrainian Victory, Ukraine. And last but not least, Krastev, founder and chairman of the board for the Center of Liberal Strategies in Bulgaria. Maybe starting off, would you agree? That who has the strategic initiative right now? Is it Russia or the West? Very quickly, starting with Mike.
So I would say that the West clearly has the strategic advantage. Whether we take the initiative remains to be seen.
Muriel?
I think we're not doing so poorly, and it relies on us to show determination and keep the pace.
From Kiev, what does it look like, Daria?
From Kiev, we see that it's not just Russia. Just Russia was 2014. Now it's Russia, Iran, North Korea, backed up by China. And this gang against the West has the initiative. Ukraine tries to regain initiative, for example, with a surprise Kursk operation. But obviously, to regain the initiative, we need the joint plan and empowerment with our allies.
Ivan.
I'm going to give you a Bulgarian answer. It depends on the day.
Could you perhaps elaborate a little bit?
Listen, there was a change. When you start a war, you have the strategic initiative. In 2022, Russia lost the strategic initiative. And by the way, changed the nature of the war. So from this point of view, this is not a static story, but where I do believe the colleagues were totally right. When Chinese president visited Russia in his first visit after the beginning of the war, he said that we are witnessing a moment which we have not witnessed for 100 years. So the fact that there are places in the world where people believe that we're in this transformative moment and where basically everything is changing is part of the picture.
Mm-hmm. So maybe let's rephrase the question then. Do we think that we have a coherent, consistent strategic signaling from the side of the West towards Moscow? And is Moscow perceiving this as a coherent and consistent, clear signaling, strategic communication from the West? Anyone who wants to pick up on that? Mike.
I'm happy to weigh in. Look, I think it's not so much a matter of signaling as it is of actions that we take. And that is precisely why President Biden has now asked for allied nations and partners to convene in the Ramstein summit on October 12th, because we have just allocated for Ukraine $8 billion in additional security assistance. This will essentially draw down the funding that we had, the $61 billion in the supplemental bill that was passed in April of this year. But we need our allies and partners to step up, because this is going to be a very challenging winter for Ukraine. Approximately 60% of Ukraine's electricity grid is currently online, and we need to prepare for what is going to be a very challenging next few months. So let's seize the initiative. This is the beginning of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, clearly, strategic signaling also include actions and non-actions in what you say. Muriel, would you like to fill in?
Yeah, I think strategic ambiguity is about keeping the adversary or placing the adversary in a situation where he bears the risk of a miscalculation. Of course, the implication is we managed to show determination on our side. So far, Putin keeps underestimating our determination collectively as allies, underestimating the Ukrainians, and the Kursk offensive showed how much he keeps underestimating the Ukrainians and overestimating himself. And the limits of authoritarian regimes is people lie to their leader. Which is why also he keeps, overestimating his own people. So the initiative is us keeping the pace of our determination, and us Europeans, especially if we want America to stay by our side, to take a greater share in our security and support to Ukraine, because this is the defining fight for our security.
Mm-hmm. Daria, we often hear the words, "as long as it takes." Does Putin believe this? Does he receive this clear strategic signaling of the credibility of the West and our ability and willingness to deliver on that?
I want to refer from another one, every inch of NATO. It all started with that message before the war. And it was strategic self-deterrence and strategic clarity what the West will not do. And I think that was encouraging Putin to actually fulfill his will to eliminate Ukraine from the map and start this large-scale invasion. And whether this strategic self-deterrence is still there, well, I think we have to check how many inches of NATO territory was already penetrated by Russia, by Russian missiles, by Iranian drones fired by Russia into Poland or into Romania, and we know for sure that some of them are being programmed to attack these territories. So many inches of NATO territory was already penetrated by Russia, and Russia knows that there was no response. There was self-deterrence. The response was that, you see, there was the weather didn't help us to identify that Shahid drone, and oops, it's disappeared. And Polish jets were extremely busy patrolling the sky when on August 26, more than 200 missiles and Shahid drones were attacking all our peaceful cities. Or we see that in Romania, something is exploding in the air, but no one can admit that it's actually a Russian missile or drone, and no one can say who is firing at them. So I think that sends a message and clear signal to Putin and those who are backing him up. Iran, China, North Korea. We can keep going. Let's do that. You see, this is the coalition of scared. And yeah, it's not helping Ukraine to gain strategic advantage and strategic surprise.
Ivan, is the signal received in Moscow?
I do believe the problem is that you're sending one signal, what is receiving is not so easy to be sure. But for me, there are two things that are important. If you go on the opinion polls globally, there is one major difference between the position of Russia, but also, by the way, most of the global South and Europe and America. When you're asking the war, is this the war of Russia with NATO and the West? Majority of the Russians said yes. By the way, also the majority of Chinese, the majority of almost everybody else with the exception of South Koreans. If you're asking our population, are we in a war with Russia? The majority said no. So you have this asymmetry, which particularly in a democratic government is not something to be taken easily. And the second thing, which in my view is important in all this conversation, because listen, knowing why the war started is not going to help you probably to know how to end it. But there is one particularity about this war and one factor that we didn't talk a lot. I was monitoring what President Putin has been talking 6 months before the invasion. And there was one thing that was coming all the time out of the things that you never expect to come. For example, talking in Vladivostok in front of the kids. And he said if it was not for the war in World War II and the Russian revolutions, now there were going to be 500 million Russians in the world. This is a war not about land. It's a war about population. The major demographic anxiety on the Russian side, the idea that there are not enough Russians, and this is why Ukrainians should be Russians, Belarusians should be Russians, is a critical element for the way the war started. So when we're trying to understand what you're gaining and what you're losing, in my view, this should not be missed. Because at the moment, he's getting a depopulated lands. He's getting ruins without people in Donbass. And on the other side, by the way, demography is also critically important for Ukraine. Because the problem of how many people, the problem of what is happening to the birth rates and others, from this point of view, this is the first war of the 21st century, because the war that is happening in the world in which we have the fear of the shrinking populations. And I find this one of the aspects that very few people are seeing. This explains abduction of the Ukrainian kids in the first week, adoption in a week with a special legislation. In my view, this kind of a demographic aspect is something that we never talk about.
Daria, you mentioned self-deterrence. And I think we, in the West, we're quite busy understanding, defining sort of alleged Russian red lines. The question is, what are our red lines? Have we defined them? And my question here is that I think by showing restraints and self-limitations from our side, I think we've often done that with the view that that would be de-escalatory, but maybe some of these measures have actually been escalatory and enabling Russia rather than being de-escalatory. So have we had that confused strategic thinking in the West on escalation and de-escalation? Daria.
Well, I think on escalation, we proved what are the Russian red lines with Kursk, and World War III didn't start. Russia didn't nuke the world. Russia perfectly explained its population, why it is okay for Ukraine to occupy a piece of its territory. And so truth is lie, winning is losing. So losing is winning. It's like a 1984 Orwell society. So they perfectly can accept losing. It's about collective West jointly with Ukraine to define what is the strategy, what's the strategic goal. And it's about being fair, that it's not up to Ukrainians only to decide, and Ukrainian people to decide, because we are not facing just Russia, right? And Ukrainian army fully depends on the supply of weapons from the collective West. Our economy went into the war economy, but we can't produce more than Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. So it's clear as that. And in Ukraine, we sometimes are a bit offended when we are saying that it's up to Ukrainians to decide how this war will end. So I think that if there was a strategic goal that Ukraine must win, and it is very related, Russia must lose, then we can start talking about tactics, how to achieve that together. Also, I think it's important to do the reality checks. Again, and we are doing these reality checks. It's not Russia now, it's not Ukrainian crisis, not Russian crisis, it's the global crisis. It's the autocracies challenging the entire idea of democracy, and they are testing that with conventional weapons in Ukraine, but they're already here in Poland, in Germany, in America, with all other warfare, including the warfare for narratives. They are trying to win the narrative, and they are trying to do different cyber attacks. They are attacking CEO of German weapons producers. So the war is already here. And it's better to get together and plan the joint victory. And I can name you a lot of tactical steps which could be done together if that's the goal.
Russia's red lines, our red lines, escalation, de-escalation. As Daria said, the signal coming out of Washington was for a long time, Ukraine must not lose and Russia must not win. Now Biden has said that Ukraine must prevail and so forth. Your thoughts on red lines and escalation?
No, look, absolutely, Ukraine must prevail. I think the messaging maybe at the beginning of the administration was perhaps misunderstood. Maybe it was not entirely as tight as it could have been. We were saying that Russia needs to suffer a strategic defeat. What do we mean by that? We don't mean the implosion of the Russian Federation as such. What we meant was that this war has to be perceived by the Russian leadership and by the Russian population as a defeat, not just now, but for future generations, for future decades, so that leaders in the Kremlin look back on this episode and they understand that this was a failure. Because if they see this as a success, or equally importantly, if this is spun inside of Russia as a success, then future Kremlin leaders will do the same thing. Maybe not in Ukraine, maybe in Georgia, maybe in Moldova, maybe in other parts of Russia's periphery. So that was the understanding behind the words that Russia must suffer a strategic defeat or failure. But at the end of the day, Ukraine does need to win. But, look, I mean, I get it. There's certain things that, people here on stage will say that will garner applause, and maybe this won't. But what we have to understand is we have to match ends and means. Too much there is a tendency to engage in magical thinking about what we want to achieve. Look, we all want Ukrainian victory, but the question is, how do we get from where we are today, where frankly the front lines in the Donbass are moving westwards? Kursk, yes, tactical, operational success so far. Can Ukrainian armed forces turn it into a strategic victory? I don't know. I think they need some guidance on that, or at least some further dialogue. But we have to understand, with the means we have, look, the United States has spent $175 billion in support of Ukraine. This is not an insignificant amount of money, and our allies have done a lot as well. But we have to understand, given those parameters, what can we achieve in the next 4 months of the Biden administration, which is what I spend my time thinking about? What can we achieve in the next year? Where should we be 5 years from now? If we engage in magical thinking and just look for applause lines from all of you, it's not going to help us to formulate the right strategy or tactics to get to where we need to go. So, look, I'm saying this not to try to rain on a parade. We all want the same strategic outcome here, but we have to be very realistic about how we achieve it and disciplined, not focusing on politically shiny objects on the battlefield that will garner political success at home, but how do we methodically, systematically prosecute the campaign on the ground to get to where we need to be?
Mm-hmm. Maybe, I mean, you were asking for, you know, whether it's a strategy here, so maybe the last question before we open up for the audience here. What could you, in your mind, the panel's mind here, be a real game changer for changing the dynamics, military and political dynamics of the Russian aggression against Ukraine?
I want very much to continue what Michael Carpenter said, because there are two things which I found critically important. Listen, we should talk in the way that our own society trusts. Because if we're talking about things that they don't believe are happening, then we're going to have a problem, particularly if it's going to be on a long run. And one of the things, listen, I'm Bulgarian, this is not Poland, this is not Sweden. But in order to keep European Union together, you should all these governments and publics to support for long term. Kursk was a tactical, probably success, but the claim that basically Kursk shattered Russian political elites and Putin was never as weak as at this moment, I didn't see any sign for this. And from this point of view, being realistic is critically important. The second thing, which in my view is important, is China does not want Russia to lose. But there is a lot of signals that Chinese banks are quite reluctant working with the Russians and so on. Why I'm saying this? Listen, if we are going to say that we're also in a war with China and others, it does not make it easier for our societies to mobilize and to help. And I'm saying this because the rhetoric matters. One of the things is that Russians believe that they're winning at the moment, and they should be, first of all, stopped. And this is critically, and this is going to happen in Donbass, and this is going to show that they're going to lose so many people that they cannot continue like this. This is what the Ukrainians did in 2022, when they basically managed to reverse the Russian offensive. And by the way, public opinion changed dramatically. Because part of the story is that European publics stays and are very much influenced of what is happening on the battleground. And this is really important. I was going through all these things and so on. If we're saying things that people believe that we're just talking on a conferences but are not happening, then this is really becoming much more difficult for the politicians to go and push for what they're doing, because in this year we have so many elections that you basically, the shape of the war is decided in the battlefield, but also in the ballot boxes in many of the countries that we represent. And from this point of view, at least for us, how we talk about the war is part of the strategic behavior. Russians are talking, by the way, escalating all the day. They're talking about the nuclear in the way the Soviets have never been talking. In a certain way, and from this point of view, it's very important for us to make people understand that it's realistic, that Russia really lost first the special operation, and now they're going to lose the war, because in a certain way they also don't know exactly what is their strategic objective too. Just destroying Ukraine is what I see as the strategic objective. But if we're in a wishful thinking or magical thinking that Michael was saying, we are not helping ourselves. At least this is my view.
Muriel, are we stuck in a sort of mental and objective stalemate? But is there anything we can do to change either the military or the political dynamics? And then I will ask for questions for the audience, so please prepare.
Look, I would join Michael on the magical thinking dimension. I think expecting a grand soir is not, would not be the right way to go. And holding in our support to Ukraine all together, and the Europeans holding in terms of mobilizing our societies, because again, this is a defining fight. No matter what happens on the other side of the ocean, is the right way to go. And of course, Ukraine holding is key there. they are being so heroic that we have to be holding as well. But expecting a grand soir would expose us to be deceived. So even I would see the Kursk offensive in the more in the broader context of us not self-deterring. Not deterring ourselves when it comes to Russia. And there again, I would argue that the collective West is doing an okay job in terms of securing the eastern flank. And I wouldn't say that the drones, missiles, whatever, flying, you know, slightly inside the NATO's eastern flank is an intentional provocation by Russia. I would call that intentional carelessness, which should be blamed, but I wouldn't blame NATO. I would defend, as the former French perm rep to NATO, you might be surprised, but I would defend NATO on that.
Okay, that's, I think, a separate discussion, and this whole discussion on escalation and de-escalation. We are running behind schedule, so I will allow 3 quick questions and then back to the panel. So please raise your hands. Okay, so we have 1, 2, and 3. Please, the lady. And please shortly introduce yourself and a quick, succinct question.
Hello. It's working. Hello again. My name is Katya Dekanoidze. I'm the member of the Parliament of Georgia, opposition, not the majority. I will have the question to Mr. Carpenter. Since we're talking about Russia, my country suffers from Russia, I mean, still, not only the occupation of the 20% of my territory, but also it's a proxy war, hybrid war, and the tycoon Ivanishvili, who is grabbing the power, captured the state, and now probably he wants to capture the elections, because we have elections on 26th of October coming soon. And these elections are existential for Georgian people. So his ties to Russian oligarchs are very much vivid, actually, and I know that the US State Department put the travel ban on 60 officials from Georgian Dream. This is a ruling party. And also, 4 of them are now under the sanctions, financial sanctions. I would really, I really want to ask you, maybe US administration, Biden administration, considering to take very active measures against Ivanishvili, who is really grabbing the Georgian people's will before elections.
I think we get the question.
Yeah,
Thank you.
This is
Edward Lucas, please. And I have Mr. Pisarski and the Swedish ambassador looking very sternly at me, so we are running out of time here.
Yes, just quick suggestions about how we can rebuild our escalation ladder to respond meaningfully to sub-threshold attacks.
Okay, and the third question here.
President for Georgian Development. It seems that we have a war of mistakes, mistakes of EU in Georgia, mistakes of Russia against Ukraine. So I would like to ask to analyze what kind of mistakes is making Ukraine now and Europe. Thank you.
So thank you. One direct question to Michael Carpenter on sanctions on Georgia. Then the questions of lessons learned, what was enabling, was escalatory or de-escalatory, and new thinking on sub-threshold, and how do we think about escalation and the escalatory ladder. So we will have less than 1 minute each for the panel to address these questions, and then we will have to wrap up. Michael.
Okay, great. I'm not going to mince words in answer to you, Katya. What the Georgian Dream government is doing right now is taking Georgia 180 degrees away from Euro-Atlantic integration. If they continue with this path of undermining civil society, transgressing fundamental freedoms, implementing the foreign agents law, and if the elections are not free and fair, they will not be entering NATO or the EU anytime soon, and we will continue to adopt measures like the ones we have with our visa policy and our global Magnitsky sanctions that impose consequences on those who violate democratic norms. There cannot be this degree of gap between the aspirations of the Georgian people for a Euro-Atlantic future and what the government is currently doing. I want to be absolutely clear about it. It is unacceptable what we're seeing on the ground. I want to take 30 more seconds on Ed Lucas's question, which I think is a great one, and there's not a lot of answers on this, but I want to say a few things. First, it's vital that we build a common operating picture at NATO, that we share the intelligence so that we're seeing the threats 360 as they take place across both the Euro-Atlantic area and beyond. Because what Russia is doing right now, the scale, scope, severity of hybrid measures is off the charts. They are brazen beyond anything that we've seen in previous years. We also need to use more effective law enforcement strategies and cooperations to be able to roll up some of these networks of proxies that are undertaking these operations so that we deter those marginal criminal elements that are doing this from wanting to participate in these sorts of operations. And then last but not least, and this is the trickiest part, is cost imposition. Given everything that we're doing in the Ukraine context, how do we impose additional costs? But we must, and we will. Because if this continues, we will face a catastrophe at some point. Something is going to go desperately wrong, whether intentional or unintentional, and we will have to, at that point, impose costs on the Russian Federation to signal that this is unacceptable, because it is potentially an Article 5 scenario. So that's where we need to be leaning. But the third of those elements is the trickiest, and the one where I don't think that, at least right now, Western governments are well poised to respond.
Thank you. Muriel, 60 seconds on your thoughts on this question.
Georgia, I would agree with Michael again. I think we made clear as France and the EU what our expectations are. It strikes me from my personal perspective of having traveled to Georgia quite a number of times in both a personal capacity and professional capacity, how a country partly occupied by Russia turns out to be ruled by people that act in a Russian way. Escalation, de-escalation, well, two things would prove escalatory. One is overreaction, and on the other side, weakness is escalatory as well. Let me take the example of the Black Sea. That is SCEEUS' area of responsibility. I would argue that patrolling close to the coast of Crimea would be escalatory, but at the same time, self-deterrence would be paradoxically escalatory as well. We as France keep flying manned flights, you know, above the Black Sea, and rightfully so.
Okay, thank you. Daria, 60 seconds. We are running behind us.
You're too tough. So magical versus reality measures. In 22, magical reality was Ukraine will give up Kyiv in 3 days. Now we are in the reality when Ukraine is in Kursk, right? So therefore, let's answer the question, why invitation for Ukraine to NATO now is not a reality? Another question, why seizing 300 billion Russian frozen assets, most of which are in Europe, are not a reality? Another question, why air defense shield our Ukraine where Russian missiles entering Ukrainian territory and attacking nuclear power plants in Ukraine, which can cause nuclear disaster, is not a reality? Why? Why training Ukrainian troops by NATO and coalition of willing members in Ukraine is not a reality yet? There are many measures which could have been taken if there was the clarity and strategic initiative of the collective West, which should understand what is the cost of Ukraine losing. This is the reality check about what is magical and what is real.
Thank you, Daria. Ivan, final words.
I do believe that Ukraine should be allowed to go with a deep targeting, particularly on the energy infrastructure of Russia. Because in a certain way, this is also something that is going to make countries like India and others understanding that you cannot allow, basically, to destroy the energy infrastructure of Ukraine with no cost. So from this point of view, I'm much more, to be honest, afraid of the symbolic things. Invitation to NATO now means exactly what?
Mobilization and future for you, promise for future for Ukraine.
No.
Invitation for NATO, it means that there will be security guarantees and that I will be able to tell to my son that in 6 years, he will be, if needed to fight, he will be fighting in the NATO army. Invitation to membership for Ukraine means a lot. It's the hope that we're going to have future, that we are not digging and agreeing for a ceasefire or whatever and preparing for a new war in 5 or 6 years. So that's a lot.
My only point is, when we make symbolic politics, saying strong words, and after that nothing happens on the ground, this is not an escalation or de-escalation. This is simply bluffing. If you're going to have an invitation, you should say it also what it means now, not in 6 years. And this is why I'm afraid that Western governments are quite often over-delivering on the symbolic side when it comes to concrete things. And by the way, some of the things that you said are concrete, on the air defenses and so on. But inviting somebody to NATO in 6 years, I'm saying this because in a certain way, if nothing is happening, if I'm a Ukrainian, we invited to NATO and nothing is different than it was yesterday, I'm going to be more depressed than inspired.
Okay, thank
Fredrik,
you.
I know you want to wrap. I just want to say one last thing, which is...
One sentence, Mike.
Look, I mean, Daria is absolutely right on the frozen Russian assets, by the way. But let's talk about what needs to happen right now. More mobilization of additional troops, training, indeed, equipping of those troops, that needs to happen right now.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen.
Motivation for them that they have future, that there will be NATO membership of Ukraine.
I think, as you've heard from this discussion, maybe there's no full clarity on who's having the strategic initiative and how to get it and what is escalatory or de-escalatory. We had important discussions here on, how do we frame, how do we understand, how do we talk about things. And we also had, the question of resources, magical thinking. Then again, clearly the West's collective resources is much bigger than Russia's. And then the important question is, what are the opportunity costs of not succeeding and so forth. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in giving this panel a warm applause.